Henry, would you like to
Act
begin
2?
with Act 2 and
Act 2, Aaron and Beyond.
Aaron and Beyond.
Right.
Well, you mentioned how you met, but how that relationship
Okay.
developed, if you could, right? We're going to start there.
Well, yes.
I was going to start with a Love Boat.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Are we
Which
rolling?
started pre-Aaron.
Hmm?
Which started pre-Aaron.
Yeah, so let's start there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll talk in some detail about the development of the initial Love Boat television movie. There were 3 of them.
But there were 2 actual television movies and the pilot, which was 90 minutes. And the first 2 hours, which were done as movies of the week, both rated, they were 1, 2, or 3 for the week. I had the idea, obviously that was a series, but Brandon wanted it as a series of television movies, and he was still in the movie area when I sold it, so we started out as a television movie. We made a deal with a great deal of trouble with Pacific Cruises, because they were the earliest. It doesn't sound to me like there was more to it than that. What was it called?
Pacific Princess?
Pacific Princess, yes.
Yeah.
And they had a few ships that weren't very elegant, and we got turned down by 3 or 4 other lines. I had always loved ships, and crossed first when I was in college in the Ile-de-France, and through my years at ABC, whenever I had to go for ABC to London or Paris, I would always take the ship over when I could and plan it over a weekend, and you did it in 5 days, and I missed 2 days of work, but it was glorious. And so I had this fascination with ships, and I knew all the lines and what was available, and when I sold the show, I thought they would all leap at the idea. And of course, they all said no. They didn't want their passengers bothered. It was then a much smaller, more select business. And Cunard said no. Royal Scandinavian, was it?
Royal Canadian, yeah.
Royal Norwegian.
Yeah.
There were 4 of them that all said no. And finally, Pacific said, okay, we'll sell you the space. But we had to buy, in the first couple, we had to buy everybody's space, cabins. After the first one, where they hadn't notified passengers, and a lot of passengers got very unhappy because they were traveling with someone that wasn't their wife or husband, or that they shouldn't be with. And they also, the people that paid a lot of money, didn't like a film crew all over the place. And anyway, it was tough to get them to say yes the second time. And the third time, we couldn't push them into saying yes. So we'll get them jumping ahead of myself. But the first 2 were actually done on cruises from Los Angeles down toward Cabo San. Remember where we went? Cabo San Lucas and
Cabo San Lucas was one place. Yeah.
Right, which is now very fashionable. Then it was a hellhole. It was not much. And Sonata.
That was the other one.
I didn't realize that the first 2 movies they were actually transporting passengers.
They were with passengers. We got off the ship when they got off and had a crew prepared. We were shooting around them day and night on the ship. We realized after the first one that most of the people aboard the ship were elderly, shall we say. And so we started having to bring along our own extras. I even think that somewhere along the way on the first one we realized it and got some extras and got them there before we finished shooting so you could have a decent body around the pool.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we built some of the berths back after the first one, and I think after the second one they had done, I was using 20th Century Fox for my offices then, because it was always my favorite lot. And Aaron and Len had either done a Starsky and Hutch, where they put up part of a cruise ship, does that ring a bell?
No.
Or Fox had done a movie where they had some remnants of cruise ship. So we managed to use that and shoot. The first one, we didn't quite get the regulars right. And now you have to help me with this. It was an Australian who played the captain. Very sexy, very elegant man, but he had an Australian accent.
Very heavy accent.
He'd be a star today, but then it was just a good-looking hunk with a heavy accent. And the girl didn't have too much charm. Do you remember who the first one was?
I don't remember who they were.
Yeah. One or the other was after Freddie Silverman had come around, or it was somebody he really loved named Terry something. But the first one, anyway, it was finished. Brandon didn't think much of it. It went on. I wasn't wild about it. It went on the air. It got fabulous numbers, and they ordered the script for a second. Between the first and the second, Aaron and Len had decided they weren't happy working together. They had 5 shows on the air. They were the hottest things in television, but for a variety of personal reasons, it wasn't working, and they decided to separate. Just after the separation, whether propelled by each of them having known me, or by Bill Hayes, who I certainly think was part of it, the business manager that I mentioned, the lawyer, they both called and asked me to dinner. And one night I had dinner with Len and Wendy and his wife, and the next night I had dinner with Aaron and Candy. And they both asked me to join them as a partner in the new company that they were going to form. Well, my instinct was to go with Len because I really liked him a lot. I'd been a little unhappy that when I'd gotten divorced, I felt he and his wife had taken too much the side of my wife, and which most of Hollywood did, but that was easy to forgive. But the real intrigue about Aaron was that he had just made this enormous commitment with ABC, where they guaranteed him a couple of shows a year on the air and paying for his company. It was like he was an independent studio within the network. And so I made the deal with Aaron. Len and I didn't speak for a couple of years, which was unfortunate. And during the time that they were separating their company and I was building the other one with Aaron, I was only allowed to go in Aaron's office and meet with him on the Mondays and Fridays that Len was off. So it was very strange. And there were times when I got into it, Bill Hayes always insisted that he represent both sides of any partnership he put together, like Yorkin and Lear or Aaron and Len or myself. And so that was a little uncomfortable, and later really came to major problems when the company went public.
Did the business aspect of it differ between Aaron and the other people that you're dealing with? I mean, did you get a bigger percentage of the profits with Aaron?
Well, with Aaron and Len had been 50-50 partners. And Aaron, if I had gone with Len, we would have been 50-50 partners. But it was 50-50 of the future, and there was no commitment. With Aaron, it was, because he had this ABC commitment, he made it 50-25, 75-25. And that I didn't realize at first, and made me catch my breath, but then I realized it was 25% that he was offering of an enormous arrangement. Also, the other stickler was when Aaron had me meet with Warren Cowan and said that it wasn't going to be spelling Cramer as it had been spelling Goldberg. It was going to be Aaron Spelling Productions, and I was going to be executive vice president, stuck again.
How'd that make you feel?
It was a little strange, but even stranger was that I was not to give any interviews or to do any press, that it was all Aaron and it was his company, and he'd seen other people get the press and the credit. Aaron had by then been through 4-Star and the Danny Thomas relationship, and then Len. And so Aaron, to his last days, it was always Aaron Spelling Productions, although there was always someone. I was there for 14 years, Len for 6, me for 14, Darren Starr for about 4, in terms of Beverly Hills 90210 and Melrose Place were Darren's. And then the other things, there were 2 women I didn't even know that were involved, and they were always the creative. Aaron was one of the great salesmen of all times. He had fabulous sense of casting and story, but he really didn't want to get involved with the same show year after year. And in television, part of the secret is it has to keep working, it has to keep being good. And Aaron's tastes were still, in many ways, a little Texas. His house that remains in California is sort of a monument to that. That's an unfair thing to say, but it's still...
You're right, because I've been in that house.
You've been in the house, yeah. It is, it was a sense, I knew if Aaron was pleased with something, then a lot of America would be. But anyway, with Aaron, so I made the deal. I agreed there'd be no press and no publicity for me. It would be his company. And the only shows that were pure 50-50 were the things that I had in development then, that I already had. And there was a long list. And I was allowed to keep doing Wonder Woman, which had gone on ABC and was working. And the day Aaron and I started, I had Wonder Woman, and I had 6 or 8 shows at various stages, and we got an order as part of making the deal for the second 2-hour Love Boat to try to make it now work. I guess Fred Silverman had just come there,
right,
because that's how Terry O'Mara was the first cruise director, and God knows who the cruise director was on the second show. I pleaded with David Hedison to do it, and he wouldn't do it, and I can't remember. Do you remember who it was?
I don't remember that, no.
Do you have a record of it there? It'd be interesting. But
Gabe Kaplan's the name was.
That's the first one.
Oh, the first one.
Gabe Kaplan was a guest star.
Oh.
But we had the concept of guest stars, and telling 3 stories, and one would involve the crew, and the other one a passenger in a crew, and the third one 2 passengers. That was always sort of locked in.
How did you come up with the 3 storylines?
Just looking at it and thinking about it and remembering Love American Style and the 5 or 6 shows in between that we tried to develop. And that's the same concept that they actually lifted, we lifted and used in a hotel. And the interesting thing is that even though I had joined Aaron and we had Love Boat on the air, he and Len had, at ABC's request, done another very similar show called Fantasy Island. And they had made a movie, and then a second movie with Ricardo Montalban, and it was 3 stories, and the interlocking of the stories around the island, so it was a little competitive. But it was, as I say, I joined him. We got the pickup on a 2-hour movie of Love Boat. We made it. It was the first thing we did together. Went on a cruise ship again. Candy came. Aaron was involved in the casting. We had everybody except the cruise director and the captain, Wright. And the show went on the air. It tested very well, got great ratings, but the network didn't like the leads. They did order one more script. And about a year after I joined Aaron, we had other things in work. We took a meeting with Brandon Stoddard, who was then head of programming. And I actually took the meeting. Aaron was late and didn't show up. And I mentioned the new script and what did Brandon think of it. And he said something like, it's crap. And we've done 2, and you can't get it right, and it doesn't have a future. Forget it. And I was really hurt. Not just that it was my 50% show going down, but I had a gut feeling about it. So I finished the meeting with with Brandon, came out in the hallway at ABC. There was Aaron, who was arriving for a meeting with Fred Silverman, Brandon's boss, and I told him what had happened, and he said, "That's terrible." He said, "Come with me." He pulled me into Fred's office and said, "Tell Fred what just happened to you." He said, "Fred, I want you to hear this because this has just happened with our network to my partner." And I told the story, slightly modified version, and Fred said, "It's a fabulous idea." The man who had brought us Super Train said it was a fabulous idea. I love it. It's the best thing in development. I was looking at our development last weekend, and I realized how great it is. We're going to make it. We'll make it as a pilot and screw Brendan. And he said, but it's got to be finished in 63 days or something, because we were coming into pilot season. Well, I was elated. Aaron had done his magic as only he could do. We had a partner. I went to the ship line. They said, we're booked solid. It's the spring. We can't get you on a ship at all. And Aaron said, don't worry. He said, we'll just do a 90-minute film. We'll use the clips from what we had before of the ship sailing and film the rest on the stages. And we did. And no one realized the difference. And through the casting, everybody zeroed in on who the captain should be and who the cruise director should be. And the final go to film was contingent on delivering them. And we kept reaching dates. We were getting closer and closer to starting to shoot. And the network was putting up more and more money, and we didn't have a cruise director. And finally, someone suggested Gavin. I don't know whether it was the casting director or Freddie. It may have been Freddie who had come from CBS, but Gavin had just come off of Mary Tyler Moore, and what else before that? The Ed Asner Show, I guess.
He did one other
More
series
of a
before
heavy,
that, yeah.
And we met with Gavin at Aaron's luxurious house in Bel Air at that point. And Aaron snowed him about the show and its future and what a great shot we had. And Gavin said, I'll do it. And they pulled back all the barriers and we were set to shoot, but we didn't have a cruise director. And we kept coming up with one idea after the other, and we were 14 hours away from shooting. And Candy said in a meeting at the house where we were desperate, with the person at the network working for us. I don't know if you were there or not.
I was there.
Remember when Candy said, there was a girl who I saw on Starsky and Hutch last week, and I don't even remember her name, and Aaron made a call, and she was a waitress from the Valley, and the casting director had seen her when he'd been having dinner in a restaurant, and she waited on him, as I recall, and they had cast her in this minor role. We brought her in to meet the network. We were all desperate. We would have gone with Thelma Ritter at that point and said, okay. And that was it. We were cast. Now, there's another side to the Love Boat story, because in development, we needed someone with a real comedy sense. Aaron and I must have had a dozen projects going at that point. 2 years after I joined Aaron, when he and Len, 3 years, he and Len had their last show canceled, we had 5 shows, 5 hours on the air. So it had gone very quickly and very well. But we brought somebody in, and I had met Duke Vincent, now known as E. Duke Vincent, who was a comedy writer and a sometimes producer. But I knew everybody loved him, and he was a great hand-holder. And when he met Aaron, they hit it off. And we brought him in as a junior member of the team, partner, but he stayed with Aaron to the very end. I left. he stayed through all those other people, and no one could make Aaron laugh the way Duke could. Duke had a wonderful idea for a show that he was so enthusiastic about that I think he wrote it, and he got Aaron and the network thinking that it was the hit. And they had to put one of our shows on the air that year because it was the end of the first year commitment. And the other show we made was called San Pedro Beach Bums. Does it ring a bell? Mm-hmm. It was Duke's favorite show of all time, which was the Bowery Boys. And he had grown up in Hell's Kitchen in New York and knew this world and made this, to me, incomprehensible pilot about 5 guys who really played more like retards and were a pack who got into all kinds of trouble. Both pilots arrived in New York. I was there selling. Aaron Candy came in on the train because he didn't fly. And after about a week, we hadn't convinced the network. I hadn't convinced them on Love Boat. Duke and Aaron couldn't get anybody seriously to talk about San Pedro Beach Bums. Aaron said, I had a vacation scheduled with my kids and my wife in Kona Village in Hawaii. And he said, you go ahead, don't keep them, I'll handle this. And he sent me to Kona Village. We left Duke in New York. 3 days later, I get a call from Aaron in Kona Village saying, I've got some good news and some bad news. And I said, what's the bad news? And he said, Love Boat didn't make the schedule. And I said, that breaks my heart. Will we ever do another pilot? He said, I don't think there's really a shot at it. But he said, San Pedro Beach Bums did. And he said, it's a fantastic show. You've got to come around about it. It's going to be a breakthrough hit. It'll be top 10. It'll be on for 10 years. And he then offered me a percentage of his piece of San Pedro Beach Bums, so I wouldn't feel so badly about it, which was a lovely, wonderful gesture. Well, I was crazed, and I called New York, and short story, there was one other show from Universal that ABC loved the pilot, but the cost was so expensive, they didn't order it. At the last minute, someone at ABC said, we can't have Universal push us around. And we financed Aaron's company, and there were a lot of people, including Fred Silverman, who loved Love Boat, and Fred said, put Love Boat on the air. Mm. So Love Boat got on, and San Pedro Beach Bums got on. It was bought off after 5 or 6 weeks and disappeared into the oblivion that it deserved. And Love Boat ran for 9 years. But it was just, it was that close. And the combination of Love Boat and the show that had been ripped off of Love Boat and got on the air sooner, and the two of them ran and ran, but Fantasy Island, I think, was off after 5 years. It was still a big run.
What was that initial mixture of magic that you sensed about Love Boat that you think led to that longevity?
Well, it was obviously the multi-stories. It was also the characters that you could identify with that both worked. And finally, it was the setting. It was the fact that, like a great cruise ship or a resort or a fabulous hotel, people, particularly in the 70s, loved 80s, early 80s, loved glamour. And the sexuality of being on the boat. We started out, there were real concerns in the first few months about the show because the pilot, the captain, was an ex-alcoholic.
As part of the story.
It was part of the story, right. The network said to me one day when we were developing it, you know, the captain's not very interesting, give him a story. Having just divorced an alcoholic, I said, let's make him an ex-alcoholic. And then as we got closer and we thought we were going to, the appeal was a little too racy, we gave him an illegitimate child. And if for the early 80s, that was really something. All of our stories, if you go back to the first 2 or 3 years, which are just about to come out, you saw things you didn't normally see on television. Charlie's Aunt, an old Broadway hit about cross-dressing, was ripped off by John Ritter in one of the early stories. They wouldn't put it on the air. We filmed it. It was fantastic. They wouldn't let us put it on in the first 3 for fear it would shock people and we would lose audience. We did in the second show, Loretta Swit and somebody else, we ripped off Noel Coward's Private Lives, in that it was a couple that were both remarried, and on the Love Boat they meet the people they were married with before, who were there on their honeymoon, and they end up going off with the original pair. But that was for television. It was shocking that people would go to bed and have a good experience, but not run off getting married. And so there was a heady aura of sexuality. Some advertisers were afraid of it. But the network had the courage and the conviction, and Aaron supported us all the way down the line in doing it, to let us push. He kept saying, push the envelope, push the envelope.
Well, the originality of the stories also helped tremendously.
Yes.
Because people who were watching TV could not see a story like that on any other series.
On television, that's very true. That was one of the other things we did, I'd forgotten, but I really felt it was important that the stories were written by different writers, that you had the flavor and the feeling in each story of somebody else's comic sense. And it took a month with the Writers Guild to get them to approve and to let us do it. And there was a very heavy interlocking pattern where you paid for 3 20-minute segments or whatever they were, measured by time, and then someone else who ended up being the supervising producers to tie it all together. And so we were able to have the stories come in separately, read them, see how effective they were, and then all the producers, you had that in Art Bear and Ben Jolson, who were the original writers, and Gordon and Lynn Farr, had big, like, boxes in their office where they would match stories and put together the hours. Then the material would be written to go around them. And that was unique. We didn't do that on, I don't think they did it on Fantasy Island. We didn't do it on Hotel. It was all written by the same person. But I think it had a lot to do with the flavor of the show. And then we also, when we were doing the show, we insisted on traveling, and we made our deal with Princess where we actually went to Acapulco and through the Panama Canal and to Alaska and built a big backlog of footage. So we managed with all of our regulars to put that in, and after the 3rd year, I worked out an arrangement with the network where the show was rating so well, they gave us like an extra $1 million or $2 million, and we took it every year somewhere in the world. And so we found other cruise ships, came up with the flimsy excuse to shoot on them, and we took the show to Japan. We shot in Beijing and Shanghai, Hong Kong. We went to Australia and New Guinea. We went through the Mediterranean. We went to Israel.
Alaska?
Alaska, often. The Grecian islands, Italy, the south of France, and up to the Sweden, Norway.
Yeah.
So we were all over, and we got a lot of foreign guest stars, and we would film 3 2-hour movies every summer on a cruise, and then we would also film up to 34, I guess, 32, 34 1-hours, which were back on the Princess going to Alaska or to Mexico.
For each season?
Yeah, for each season.
How did the each of those 3 pilots differ from each other in terms of story?
You know, I would have to look at them all again to be able to say.
I don't even know myself.
Yeah.
But
I felt that the third that sold was sort of the most ordinary and really not as special as any of the others. But it worked the best because we had a wonderful director named Dick Kynan, who, when he wasn't in L.A., he was on the Riviera, and he had an extraordinary life and a great, great sense of comedy of all genres and kinds.
He was very professional, too.
Very professional.
Yeah.
And could get on and off the ship. Because it was really, we stuck with the ship's cruise schedule. And the cruise, you were off at 7 in the morning with the equipment and the actors, and we were back on board at 5 or 6 and sailed on to the next port. So it was a phenomenal schedule in its day.
Did you have to convince the network to make pilot number 2 and number 3?
Yeah. Pilot number 2 was a big, big battle with him, and pilot 3, as I just told the story about Freddie, we had to beat, it was Aaron convincing Fred to do it.
Let's skip down to about the some of the guest stars that made it to the show. Hearing you tell the story a little while ago about rushing down the hill to watch Milton Berle's show, you know, I mean that you got him on the show, and then Andy. Could you talk a little bit about how you got them on?
Milton, right? I was, by this time I'd had a lot of years in Hollywood, and I was missing New York and loving it. And in the 80s, I was, thanks to Aaron and Love Boat and the other shows, was making money and collecting art more aggressively. And, you know, I would, if I wasn't on the set, sometimes I'd be at Studio 54 or in New York at an opening night, and my life was a little more interesting. And in the middle of all that, I started to jazz up the shows, finding ways of bringing what was New York there. We had Bobby Short, who was always my favorite singer in cafes, came out and did a show, or Peter Duchin. We introduced, I talked to Andy Warhol, the only artist actually that we talked into it.
Was that because of your relationship?
I knew Andy. I'd wanted him to, I was collecting his work, and I made a deal where he would do my portrait, Candy's portrait, and the portrait of the 1,000th star, if he agreed with the star, and I delivered a star that he thought was worth his doing it. And so I gave him a list of 20 names, and he had the right to knock 10 of them off. And out of the 10 that were left, we delivered Lana Turner. And so he did Lana's portrait and did the show himself. And we spent, the writers went and met with Andy, and he worked over every line of his script and his wardrobe. As Henry remember, when we got him on film and ready to do it, he just started to giggle and didn't say much more than, yeah. But I had some wonderful parties for him when he was there. And Candy got her portrait. I thought he was only doing a double portrait of me, and only in the last 3 years I found out he did 9 of them that I never even knew existed. And the one he did of Lana, she didn't like. You know, the way he worked, he'd do Polaroids, hundreds of Polaroids. You would agree on one, it was blown up on a canvas silk screen, and then he painted on it. The one he did of Lana, the way she looked, she thought looked terrible. And she sent it back. And he said, well, who would you like to look like? and she sent him a picture from Johnny Eager, a movie of the 30s. So he blew it up, and that was her portrait. And I've never seen that portrait again in any of the shows or anywhere. I understand Cheryl, her daughter, has it, and it's in her office. And the original portrait that he did that she turned down was in the retrospective of Andy's work at the Museum of Modern Art. And I walked in on the opening night, and there it was, and I flipped. I looked at the little label attached, and it was from the collection of Cy Newhouse.
Cool. I wonder how that
A
happened.
major collector. Well, he had been down to Andy's and looked and bought it, just saw it was sitting there. I went down 3 years ago, and there were a multitude of portraits that he had done during that time. In those days, the first portrait was $25,000. And once you bought one, you could then get the second for $15,000 and the third, fourth, fifth, or sixth, because he loved a whole wall of them, was, I think, down to $10,000. And after he was gone in the 90s, the real celebrity portraits, I mean, Marilyn and Liz and Brando just sold for $30 million. But they all have always been extraordinary because they were very unique, Jackie and the two and Liz and Marilyn. But the run and mill that he did all the time just sort of sat there until the last 3 or 4 years. And I saw one of mine that I didn't even know existed was at the Basel Art Fair last year, and it was $1 million a picture. So it's remarkable how the art world and Andy and all that works, and they show the Love Boat at the Whitney Museum. It's part of their collection.
You also gave him a role in one episode of the Love Boat.
That was part of the deal.
Yeah.
That he would do the role, right? Yep.
Is there anything else you want to ask about Love Boat?
Well, I just want to go on record because it was unique that it all was shot in 6 days, each episode.
That's right, it was, because normally it was 7 or 8 for
Yes.
an hour show.
And the other question here was whether...
Because we had a tough producer who got everybody on and off stage, Henry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Got them cheered up, full of energy. And even when we had, like, remember the moment when we had Ethel Merman and Carol Channing on a show, and they hadn't spoken for 20 years. They were one of the great Broadway feuds because Hello Dolly was written by Jerry Herman for Ethel. And when she read it and heard the songs, she said, nobody's going to look at this. I'm not going to play this crap. And Carol did it, and it was a great hit in Carol's calling card. So we cast them both in the show without telling either one of them. It was the 2-hour musical with the mother.
Yeah.
And you remember? And somehow I didn't tell Henry this, and we sent the car, a limousine, to pick up Carol at the Beverly Wilshire, and then it went to get Ethel at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Ethel got in one side of the car, the guy opened the door, she saw Carol, and went straight across the car and got out the other side and slammed the door and went back into her hotel room. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that, but I do remember...
I had to go to the hotel and talk her into coming back to work.
In the musical number that had the entire cast and
Right.
guest stars in it, Carol was at one end, and Ethel was at the other end of the
Right.
group.
Yeah, that was as close as you could get them.
Yeah.
They finally, after the 2 weeks or so, it was a 2-hour movie. It was supposed to have been Pearl Bailey, and then her heart kicked up, and it was Della Reese. They were all members of the cast's family. Ethel was Fred Grandy's aunt. Carol Channing was, who, Doc's mother,
Yeah, something
I
like that.
think.
Yeah.
And Ann Miller was something. So an Ann danced, and it was for me, it was the fantasy of doing a Broadway musical, which it was years later until I could invest in one and do one, but it was a great moment. And everybody on the Fox lot, the days that was shooting, all the stars, the whole studio came in the door of Love Boat to watch what was going on. But that was all. When Helen Hayes came,
Yes.
Louise Rayner, who had not done television, and somehow we got her. You talked her into it on the phone in a series. I didn't have the patience for it. But let's move on.
Let's just talk briefly about some of the other guest stars that were on Love Boat, and then we'll move on to the next subject. We had Charo, and you mentioned
she was on Love Boat more than anybody else, right?
And Milton Berle.
Yeah.
We already talked about Ethel Merman. We had John Ritter and Audrey Meadows.
We've done most of
and you talked about Andy Warhol.
I'm bored with guest stars. Let's talk about shows.
Okay.
Well, the next, I guess, show that you were shepherding would be Vegas. Is that right?
It's hard for me. Vegas was our next big hit. There, Duke Vincent, having grown up in Hell's Kitchen, had incredible connections in Vegas. It seems to me, if I'm not remembering this incorrectly, his godfather was Meyer Lansky, a major up in the Vegas world living in Florida. And Duke mysteriously got approvals like no one had ever seen to shoot all over Vegas. So we were the first series, and there were, very few movies ever that had gotten in there. And it was Bob Urich, and it was a fairly ordinary show, but it had a charm of its own, and that Bob was at his best. But we had then, along that whole time, we just kept turning out probably 2 or 3 pilots a year, plus miniseries. We did Jackie Collins and Danielle Steele's first miniseries. Jackie hated what we did with it, because we cast, Aaron had promised Andrew Stevens he'd be in it, because he'd seen him socially somewhere, and Jackie hated it, and we never worked with Jackie again. Danielle, I had met socially, and we did Crossings and did it very well, which was about a cruise ship, actually before Love Boat, and about a mid-Atlantic crossing, a love affair. And then, what else? There was Finder of Lost Loves with Tony Franciosa, which was kind of Miss Lonely Hearts.
Yes.
Glitter, I couldn't remember the name, which was Time Magazine on a daily basis, and the people within the various departments, my ex-wife having been on staff at Time, and I was fascinated with that world. But they both just ran a season or two. The show, which was the most difficult show, and one of the few we've ever just walked away because we didn't want to deal with the leading lady, was Aloha Paradise, which was a blatant ripoff of Love Boat, but set in the hotel that I always went to in Hawaii on the Big Island. And there, the Gavin MacLeod was Debbie Reynolds. And let me just say, and be a gentleman, she was not easy to work with. And after 13, there was a question, and Aaron said, I can't take Doug being gone all this time, and life is too short. So that was that. What else did we? There was Bad Cats, which was about 2 people in a car, 2 cops, and the network thought that the woman couldn't act, and there was nothing special, and canceled it after 13. The woman was named Michelle Phillips. Michelle Pfeiffer. Michelle Pfeiffer,
Right.
Michelle Phillips was guesting in everything.
Yeah.
There were tons of movies. We did probably 3 or 4 or 5 television movies a year, including one of the top-rated ones of all time, was The Users, based on a book by Joyce Haber, who I married. And when I joined Aaron, again a sense of how smart he was, Joyce was so furious that I had a job and with Aaron and made such a scene that to keep her quiet, Irving Lazar suggested that we buy her book. And so the anniversary of my first month with Aaron, he said, Doug, I have a surprise for you, a big bestseller I've bought and you're going to produce it. Well, it was The Users. And I called the author and she hung up on me.
I was going to ask you what reaction you had
Right.
for her.
But it turned out that then we hired an old friend of mine who was in town and needed a job, Dominic Dunn. And Dominic served as a go-between to talk to Joyce. And we did, the book was #1 for a year almost, hardcover and softcover, and the movie was #1, and its repeat was #1. It was all about Hollywood and the inside scenes, and some of our good friends.
Who's right up?
And I was played in the movie by George Hamilton, I think. So I came out all right, better than I
was right up
did in the book, right.
Dominic's alley, because he had begun dealing with a lot of stars at that point.
Yeah, it was just really, it started him again in another whole world. But then Hotel was the next really big hit, and that was they said, how do we do Love Boat in a different setting? And I remembered the movie of Hotel and his books, which Arthur
Haley.
Arthur Haley, yeah. And Warner's owned it, so we made an arrangement with Warner's, which is why we did it on their lot, and developed it using the idea of 3 parallel stories taking place in the hotel, where the manager, who was Jim Brolin, and the owner of the hotel, which was sort of lifted from real life, was a great grand dame. And that was Betty Davis, who did the pilot, then had a stroke, and wouldn't tell us she'd had the stroke, but said she wouldn't do the series. And naturally, we replaced her with Ann Baxter, who was wonderful, and the show ran for, 4 years?
4 years.
Good period of time. And then finally, there was that little serial. What was the name of it? About the family in outside San Francisco, Denver.
Dynasty.
Dynasty.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's talk about Dynasty.
Which has slid by us.
How did that come about?
Dynasty came about because Dallas was a big hit, and Aaron and I was trying to sell a serial. He kept saying to me, "What did you do in the past that worked? Let's do it again." And I said, "Let's find the grounds to do a serial." I couldn't come up with anything that they all liked enough at the network and Aaron that worked. Dallas went on the air. I was in development and about to go on the air. And Aaron said, "Well, we'll do oil, but somewhere else. There's more oil in Denver." And he had then met in Palm Springs the Marvin and Barbara Davis, who ended up buying 20th Century. And he said, "Let's do oil in Texas." And we looked around for writers, and Brandon at ABC loved Esther and Richard Shapiro. And we called them about it. And they may not remember it quite this way, but I remember they were a little embarrassed doing a serial and doing something quite so close to what was being developed at another network or on the air. And somehow they convinced us in the network that they were doing I, Claudius, which was and they in their interviews, and I don't know if you've done them for this series, did they talk about how I, Claudius inspired them?
No.
Yeah, they did. Which was a fabulous, fabulous miniseries about a Roman emperor. Anyway, they wrote the pilot and were very involved the first year. And they really focused on the downstairs side of the family and the working class, because they thought that was different from Dallas, and that's what people wanted to see. And it was Bo Hopkins, and it was originally called Oil, and it was deeply boring. It was very, very uninteresting. And it was only Aaron's genius and that Brandon loved Esther and Richard and thought they could turn anything around. And he, in a shocking meeting at the network, said, "Well, you give us the pickup, and we will give you either... He'd had a conversation at lunch before we went to the network, and God knows where it came from a drink of tequila or what, but at the network, he shocked us all by, after we said everything, and he sensed it wasn't working. And he said, well, if you let us do all this, it'll be dynasty, and it'll focus on the richer side, and it'll be shocking, and we'll get you to go with John and Linda. We'll get rid of Bo, and we'll get rid of all those people, and we'll get you. And he took a breath, and we were all on the edge of our seats. And he said, we'll deliver either Elizabeth Taylor or Sophia Loren for the lead. And within 5 minutes, they said, it's a pickup. You have it. It's on the air. Go back to work. Well, as we walked out, I turned to Aaron, as did Esther, and said, can you do it? He said, there's no worry. I had dinner with Elizabeth last week, and with Sophia and Carlo, we're having dinner this week. Was Carlo Ponte his name, her husband? Anyway, she was not working very much, and she'd moved to the Valley, and Carlo had said she wants to do some television. So that was in his mind. Elizabeth had actually been at a big benefit, and he was in the audience and she was there, but she mentioned how she loved doing television. And when he called her first, she said, Aaron, you've got to be kidding. I wouldn't do television. I couldn't handle it. I wouldn't go through it. She never would do Love Boat. And she hung up, and that was over. And so we pursued Sophia. We met with her. We talked about it. She seriously thought about it. We discussed a price, and basically what the character was going to be. Nolan may even have talked about clothes. And about 3 weeks before we were to start shooting, but we could never announce she was doing it, Carlo called Aaron one day and said, do you know, he said, we want to talk about now when she's going to be through, because I've got a movie coming up and we want her to start in December.
And he had never mentioned that before.
He'd never mentioned that before, but Aaron had never mentioned it was a 5-year deal and that she had to do 30 shows a year. He thought it was only a limited number of movies in the first 3 months, and that was it. Totally. So she was gone. The sets were rebuilt. Everybody else had been picked up. Scripts were in work. And it was absolutely crazy. We had brought in, it was again a concept of Aaron, that at the end of that season of Oil, John Carrington's first wife walked into a courtroom in a big hat. And who was under the big hat was the secret, and that's why Aaron, I should have explained, had to deliver somebody to be under the big hat. Well, so they were both gone. We spent 48, 72 hours looking at films, talking to casting directors, calling all the agents in, and I think, once again, it was Candy who said, on a Sunday, I got a call to come to Aaron's right away. With Aaron, you work 7 days a week, 20 hours a day if necessary. He seldom slept and always wanted you available on the phone at night. But I got a call on Saturday night, come Sunday, we've got it. I'm not going to tell you anything about it. I'm going to show you a piece of film. Well, Sunday, he had gotten from the studio and showed us, and I think it was the Shapiros too, showed us a shot from a scene from Fantasy Island of Saturday Night. And it was Joan Collins as Cleopatra. And he said, this is it. And Candy said it was quite right. Whenever you couldn't get Elizabeth Taylor, all through the 60s and 70s, you used Joan Collins. And short circuit. We called the network. They agreed out of desperation. We called Joan. She was in London doing virtually nothing, was on the next plane, and came into the show. And that was Alexis. And truly, I'm sure your next question is going to be, how did the show find camp? Or did camp find the show?
Yeah.
It was really Joan and her clothes and her larger-than-life playing of that character that set the style. And what came, we had concept meetings, which was something that Aaron and Len had developed, which were a brilliant idea. When you had the script in hand a week before you shot, the director, the production manager, the producer, casting, all the key people would sit around in my office on Dynasty with the Shapiros, and then when they left the show for a while with wonderful people called the Pollocks, Bob and Eileen Mason Pollock, who really are what made, they and Joan made Dynasty, and Nolan's clothes made it all work. But we drifted into it. We found that the further we went, the more outrageous the show got, the more the audience responded. And we reached a point, actually, where I know there was an interview the New York Times came when we were such a hit going into the third year, and the Shapiros kind of washed their hands and let the Pollocks do it till we began to get Emmy nominations, and then they came back and were more involved through the end of everything. But Aaron called me, because I couldn't be in the interviews, of course. It was all Aaron. And he called and he said, I'm in this meeting with the Times, and they keep talking about Dynasty, and is it camp or high camp? He said, what is camp? I said, I don't understand it. So I had to give him a quick explanation. But it was a really lucky juxtaposition of lots of things.
It had style. It had style.
It had style.
Which most other television shows did not
Don't have, right.
Yeah.
We really, and that was Nolan, that was for the clothes, and Joan would bring back occasional Valentinos from her trips to Europe. Joan has style as a performance. John really came to it. Some of the earlier cast members that didn't have it bit the dust along the way. They thought they were irreplaceable, but there are few people today could tell you who Pamela Sue Martin or Al Corley were. But other people came and, played it. And in the middle of all that, we did make some serious moves in the gay story and in a new, what was then for television, very new and very dangerous and difficult to do.
But you did it well.
Thank you. We pushed and we did it, and the network backed us, and the Pollocks wrote it beautifully, and we had in, what was his name, who came in and played the son. Oh God, I'm going to block on Jack Coleman. He was a wonderful actor.
Mm-hmm. What were some of
We were never allowed to do more than that, have them embrace.
Right.
Yeah.
We're almost wrapping up because the tape.
Yes, we're getting near the end.
But I wonder, you talked about some of these more controversial themes. Were you hearing back from standards and practices? Were you having to fight them?
Well, there was every year there was a battle. We actually had a battle where at one point the head of ABC Standards and Practices, the Pollocks had delivered a really strong argument about bisexuality. And the head of Standards and Practices said there is no such thing as bisexuality. You're either gay or you're straight, and that's all we're going to have on ABC.
How did you resolve that?
Amazing. By showing him he was wrong.
What were the battles that you had to choose your battles?
We had to choose our battles. We had to, in terms of what we could do, how we could handle it. Aaron always wanted, and I think the network wanted, to keep that sort of string out there would he change? Would things go differently? But, I mean, finally, I think for the time that we were in, it was handled remarkably well. It was only on occasion out of desperation or out of pushing too hard that I'd say we took a misstep. When we first had the fight scenes that came between Joan and Linda, I had seen a wonderful Herb Ross picture called Turning Point. And there's a battle between Anne Bancroft and who else? Shirley MacLaine, where they really go at it. And we brought that in and showed it to everybody. And
is that the one where they end up in the water?
Yeah, in the water. So we did it and ripped it off and did it every year. And it was always a high point. Moldavia was one of those things that I often get asked about, where we shot everybody. We really were lacking direction. We didn't know how to end the season. And we weren't really sure who was working and who wasn't and how to get out of a lot of story fixes. And the Pollocks said, let's just shoot half of them off. And we won't even be sure who's alive and who's dead. And it gave us the opportunity to breathe and have the summer and figure it out.
Wow.
So, but it was an amazing thing that we shot, I would guess, 40 weeks a year to be able to do as many original episodes as we did then. Because Dynasty was a 7 or an 8 day show, unlike Love Boat.
And how many years was Dynasty on? I don't remember.
8.
8 years.
Yeah, just over 8.
And the impact,
Love Boat was the longest, yeah.
I'm sorry, the impact of a show like that, the audience that you collected, in contrast to the Love Boat audience, I mean, what was the feedback that you've gotten over the years in terms of the impact of that show?
I got stronger from Dynasty than any show that I ever knew. But I think it was really because it hit such a cross-section, and it came at a time that people picked up on it, and they watched it in bars and restaurants, and that's when they talked the next day about what happened the night before on television. And we dropped that, for years, till we got to the end of The Sopranos, or God help us, the beginning of The Survivors, and that new thing that's television out there that I don't understand anymore.
Right, but you're right, the water cooler culture,
that was it.
Do you find yourself watching much less television?
I watch now that Sopranos is off the air, I watch Entourage.
Yes.
And which is brilliant and fabulous. And nothing else gets me to the set on a regular basis, yeah.
We're going to have to stop. The tape is done. Now